Today we are discussing a phenomenal businesswoman who took a $500 loan and turned it into $55 million.
That's crazy.
Yeah. We're Compound Everything and we talk money, markets, and investing. And today we are talking about...
Rose Blumkin.
Yes.
She is a phenomenal businesswoman. So she, if you don't know who she is the first female manager ever hired by Berkshire Hathaway.
Yes.
And she kind of came in there because Warren Buffett came and bought the Nebraska Furniture Mart, or bought the majority shareholdings of it. I think in the end he ended up buying or acquiring 80% of it for Berkshire Hathaway. It sounds like the Blumkin family still owns some of it, although I don't know. It's not fully transparent to me.
And if you've ever been to a meeting or listened to a meeting, they bring up Rose Blumkin almost every year.
Frequently.
Yeah.
She is cited as one of the only business people Warren Buffett was afraid to do business against. And so we'll come up with a few quotes from him later, but I thought that is a significant claim to fame, to be a business person that Warren Buffett himself is afraid of.
It wasn't even that he was afraid of her. He could not compete with her.
No, because she did outcompete him again at some point in time. We'll get to that a little later. Yeah. So let's talk about those returns. Okay. Those are incredible returns.
They are.
So
yes.
$500 to $55 million. So
and you have to remember, this was like a while ago now.
It was. So
it's not in today's dollars.
So this happened over a period of 46 years. She turned a $500 loan into a furniture empire, or Goliath, which she later sold to Berkshire Hathaway. And that turns into, over that 46-year period, that translates into a compounded annual return of 28%.
Yeah, and that was from like the mid-30s, and is when she started it, and she sold it in the 80s.
That's correct, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how that happened. This is a woman, now just for context, this is a woman who came from Minsk, Belarus, arrived in America with absolutely nothing.
Well, she had $60.
Oh, she had $60.
She had $60 in her purse.
Okay, well, she had a small fortune.
Well, we have to be accurate.
That's true. Okay.
Yeah.
But she couldn't speak English.
No.
She had never gone to school.
She had zero formal education.
She had zero formal education in business, and she built this furniture empire with, again, no formal education. MBAs, from Harvard and Stanford and, Wharton would struggle to do this. And yet she did it without a formal education and couldn't even speak English when she started. This is a woman I want to study.
Yeah. So she didn't have a formal education, but she did have a lot of education in business.
Right.
Because she started working in her mother's store at 6 years old. Okay,
so she got an education on the go.
She actually we would call, she had an apprenticeship.
Apprenticeship in business.
Yeah, and I mean, an apprenticeship is worth $1 million degrees.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about who she is. I know you're really interested in that facet of her life and stuff like that. So why don't you kind of take it from here? Okay. Tell us a little bit about her.
Okay. So because you want to see how she grew into this.
How did she turn
of a businesswoman?
Exactly. What are her roots? How did she do it?
Right. So like you said, she was born in Russia. Her father was a rabbi, and her mother worked in a small store. Okay. And she said her father just prayed all day and didn't work. Okay. And her mother kind of provided for the family.
In her sales position or
in this little store. Yeah. And so she was working in the store by 6 years old with her mom. Okay. She moved out, I think it was around 13. She walked miles and miles in bare feet because she didn't want to wear her soles out of her shoes. And she ended up getting another job. And it was hard for her because she's this young kid who's going to hire her. And so finally she stayed at someone's house and said, like, please just let me, like, do one day for you or something.
Right. I'll show you how good I am, basically.
Yeah. And as we get through her personality, you could actually, like, envision this young child saying this. And she got up early and she, like, cleaned the store. And they ended up hiring her. And eventually, by the time that was when she was 13. By the time she was 16, she was managing, I think it was 6 grown men in this position.
Wow.
Yeah, so she was in retail almost her whole life. So she was working at all these stores, getting all this experience, and then eventually she meets her husband working at a store. Isidore, I think is his name. So she had learned a lot of business just working in retail.
Yeah.
And she was driven because she said her mother worked so hard. She wanted to become wealthy, essentially. Not wealthy, but have enough money that her mom didn't have to work like that anymore.
Right.
She was driven because of watching her mother work day and night.
Interesting.
That was kind of when she was young, that was her drive.
Right.
So you kind of see her getting this retail experience, and she meets her husband, and then there's a war, and her husband's going to get drafted, or they assume is going to, and so he has to flee to America. So he comes over to America.
They saved some money and sent him over.
Yeah, and of course,
I don't think she could come over yet because they didn't have enough money.
Yeah, it took 3 years.
Wow.
It took 3 years for her to come over. And it says, so goes the story, so I don't know how accurate this is, but he apparently took like papers from another dead soldier and then used them to get into America.
Okay.
I don't know how accurate that is.
Sure.
So take that with a grain of salt. But she ends up staying. When she left home at 13, she ended up going on the border of Ukraine. That's where she was.
Okay.
And so 3 years passes, she saves and saves and saves and saves so that she can get to America. Now at this point, she doesn't know where her husband is.
Right.
She just knows that he's somewhere in America. She gets on the boat.
Yeah.
She essentially bribes the dock guy
Okay.
to let her in and says, oh, I'll come back and give you a bottle of vodka. Then she gets to America in quite a bit of time. It was a long time. It didn't take it, she wasn't on a plane. She was on a ship, so it was weeks.
Probably taken weeks.
So she finally gets to America and she gets off at Seattle.
Okay.
Now, I think it was the Red Cross who helped reunite her with her husband.
Okay.
And they got together, and then she didn't speak any English. So it was kind of hard for her, obviously.
Yeah.
Right? It's a new culture. It's a new country. She had, like I mentioned before, $60 in her purse. And there she is in America. So they moved to Omaha.
Okay.
Because there was a Jewish community there.
Okay.
I think she spoke like Yiddish.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yiddish and Russian.
Russian, yeah. And there's a large community in Omaha who spoke that. And she says, "Oh, I wasn't." A quote by her is that I was too stupid to learn English, which obviously isn't true because she's not a stupid woman.
Right. No, she was not a stupid woman.
But
having said that, one thing I understood from her is she couldn't read or write.
No, she could never read or write.
Which is interesting. Like throughout her life, she never learned to read or write.
No, but she was very good at math.
Yes.
And that was because of all the retail she did. She just learned how to do mental math.
Yeah.
Which is just an interesting side note. You gave cash to a woman the other day at a coffee shop.
Yes.
And it took her a good 2 minutes. She froze and didn't know what to do.
That's right.
And Rose Blumkin, she knew mental math so well from just learning it with her mother, and at 6 years old it was just like a second language to her.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
Numbers were a second language, and I thought, oh, that's something that we've lost.
We have lost that, for sure.
Right, for all of our technology, and I'm not like anti-tech or anti-calculator, but it is an interesting thing to see a change.
Yes.
That was just an interesting thing. I was like, no one really sat down with her ever and taught her math. She never sat in a math class.
Right.
But she was just a math wizard because of her environment in which she grew up in.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah. So here she is. She's in Omaha. Her husband, Isidore. Is that how you pronounce it?
I think it is.
I think. If I am mispronouncing, I apologize.
Yeah.
So her husband has a pawn shop. And he ends up having a few businesses throughout his lifetime. He ends up having like a used clothing store and a pawn shop. And then eventually he starts a jewelry shop.
Okay.
But he was a terrible businessman. He was like not making money.
I remember reading that, yeah.
Yeah, and then the depression comes.
Yeah.
And she was actually instrumental in helping her husband. She taught him about profit margins. She taught him about like capital expenditures and all of that, and really helped him. And eventually they had businesses, but they never had businesses together.
Oh, interesting.
So
they always ran parallel.
They always ran. So she ran a business of hers out of the basement of his business. She also, which we'll get into, she ran it out of her home, but they actually never ran a business together. But she was very instrumental in helping her husband learn how to turn a profit. So that's kind of like a brief history of her life and how she got to Omaha and where she was coming from, which shaped her into the behemoth of a business. So
she was a woman, I would say, kind of born of hardship.
Oh, yes.
So, the war breaks out.
Shaped by hardship.
Shaped by hardship. Not born of hardship, shaped by hardship. And so she has all these challenges facing her. She doesn't know the language. She is poor. She couldn't even find her husband on arrival of America. Doesn't have $1. Well, she has $60 to her name. How are you supposed to start a business in this respect? Let's talk about the foundation or the formation of the Furniture Mart.
Yes.
So when was it started?
I think it was started in 1937.
Yeah, it was in 1937. They started the Nebraska Furniture Mart. So the Furniture Mart was started with, again, $500. It was a loan from her brother or brother-in-law. Someone funded the money, the upfront money to start. And that's how it started. It was with a $500 loan. And so that loan, she parlayed that into just a huge empire. So what are her central business tenets? She said really the basis of her business was three things. It was sell cheap, tell the truth, don't cheat nobody. Yeah. Those were the central tenets of her business.
Yeah.
And those came up over and over and over again in studying her. And she repeated that mantra several times. It was simple. But and the funny thing is, the more you break it down, the more you can see how she would actually summarize her entire business strategy in those 3 sayings. So what does this mean to sell cheap? So what does that mean? Well, it means that she would take a profit of about 10%, a profit margin of about 10%. And that caused no small stir at the time for retailers in her area. So her goal was to sell with razor thin margins, but sell huge volumes.
Yeah. Now, you could say she was kind of the pioneer of the discount retailer.
Yes.
She was Costco before Costco existed.
Yeah, she was Walmart before Sam Walton was doing that same thing. Yeah. So she pioneered this kind of volume sales kind of an idea.
Yeah, and one way she actually found this was when she was helping her husband. Because she found I think it was like a jacket or something, and they were selling for $100. And she's like, wait, I can buy this for $34, and like I can turn it around for $38.22. Yeah. And that was actually the first time that got her into trouble, because she got sued for that.
Yes. Yeah. She was sued a few times.
Yes, because she was undercutting the market.
That's right. Yeah. So her idea of sell cheap was to take razor thin margins again and to just sell huge volumes. So going back to what you said before, she was taken to court a few times, actually. At one point, I believe it was some retailers got really upset with her. And they took her to court, and they basically were trying to argue that she was selling too cheaply. So Mrs. B, as she became known as, came up and showed up without a lawyer. And
her daughter came.
Oh, her daughter came?
Because her daughter could speak English. Because Rose Blumkin couldn't really even speak English.
Right. And so at this point, the Furniture Mart was already started. And I think it was a carpet retailers who were kind of ganging up against her. And so she said to the judge, her exact quote is, "I sell everything at 10% above cost. What's wrong? I don't rob my customers." And so pretty much with that, the judge threw out the case, and then the next day went and bought $1,400 of carpet from Mrs. B. So that's the central tenet of her philosophy, was to sell cheap and really make her customers happy.
Yeah, and she really was for her customer. I think she was a very intense employer.
Oh, yes.
Sometimes I read some stories and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I would have wanted to work for her.
I don't think so.
But she was all about her customer.
Yes.
All about her customer.
Yeah. She wanted to give deals. And I think she really enjoyed giving customers deals. There's one story where I guess there was a salesman who I think it was carpet. He had negotiated a carpet price of, we'll say $12 a square foot. And so they're at the till, they're checking out, and Mrs. B rolls along and says, "Oh, $12? No, I'll give it to you for $9." At which point, I think the salesman said, "Well, Mrs. B, no, that carpet costs you $9 a square foot." Right. And she said, "Fine, I'll give it to you for $10." and then went the transaction. I think she liked selling things on the cheap, and she just enjoyed making the sale and making her customers happy.
Yeah, I think she enjoyed making her customers happy, but I think she enjoyed doing that because the more I read about her, I actually think making a sale for her was euphoric. It was the same as like a gambler hitting a win on the slot machine. Yeah. But it was a good addiction. It was a good addiction. It wasn't a damaging one. And I think she actually felt a sense of euphoria every single time she made a sale.
Well, it's funny actually, because one of the reasons she started into furniture was because she said it was a happy time. So oftentimes when people are buying furniture, they are either getting married or they're renovating their house. It's a happy time. Yeah. So they were doing something that was good, and so the customers were happy, and so it sounds like she kind of thrived off that as well.
And then I guess it just kind of turned into this loop, right? The customer's happy, I'm making a sale, that makes me happy, I want to make the customer happier, so I make more sales, and on and on.
And so Mrs. B was also notorious for apparently throwing things in. So like we go back to the selling cheap. Yeah, so apparently she was notorious for, if you buy this, I'll add a lamp, or I'll add this, or I'll add that. And so she would come along and, it sounds like even after the sale was done, she'd come along and just throw in extras for her customers because, again, she just liked to sell on the cheap.
She was probably thinking, well, if I just throw in a lamp, they're probably going to come back.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And her customers were happy, and a lot of them did come back. A lot of them were repeat customers. Now, I have a quote from Warren Buffett that kind of summarizes this point of sell cheap. He says this: "I'd rather wrestle grizzlies than compete with Mrs. B and her progeny. They buy brilliantly, they operate at expense ratios competitors don't even dream about, and they pass along to their customers much of the savings." And so, again, they just like to sell cheap. And that's basically their mantra. So her next business mantra was tell the truth. Mm-hmm. So sell cheap, tell the truth. So again, before we had talked about how she loved to give customers deals, and she was actually, it sounds like, reasonably transparent about what things cost her. And she said, look, I'm going to sell it to you at 10% over what it cost me. The other thing that I think exemplifies this character trait of Mrs. B is to, be a truth teller, is when she sold the business to Warren, apparently Warren Buffett himself drafted the purchase agreement. It was all of a page long.
Yep.
And it was essentially done on a handshake. He said, Mrs. B, do you owe anybody any money? And she says, nope, I don't. And apparently they signed the agreement, and that was the end of it. Yep. And there was really no inventory done. There was no audit. There was no investment bankers. There was, no bank statements that went around. He just trusted her because she was a well-known and reputable businesswoman. And she was reputed for telling the truth. And that was good enough for him.
So going back to the honesty, there's two things I want to touch on in what you just covered. She was almost a little too honest.
Okay.
With her customers, I think that was a really great thing. Sometimes when it came to personal relationship, she was probably a little too honest.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. And so at one point there was a falling out with Buffett and with her family after Nebraska Furniture Mart was sold, because they kind of felt that they were cutting her out, or she felt
that, yeah,
that they were kind of pushing her out.
Yeah.
And in an interview, she actually refers to her grandsons as Hitlers. She was maybe a little too honest. It's kind of like, if you have nothing nice to say, don't say it.
Yeah.
But that's just my own personal thing.
And I think she was a little too honest with her employees at some points as well.
I think she might have had a temper.
I think so too.
She kind of flew off the handle about, at one time she backed her, so she ended up in a scooter because
her knees were
she was
gone.
90 years old or something, and I think she lived to 104.
She did,
and she worked to 103.
Yes.
And when I say worked, I mean 40 hours.
Oh, at least. Yeah. I think she worked 60 to 70 hours a week.
Not at that time.
Oh, okay.
She worked 60 hours a week when she was 90.
Oh, okay.
She slowed down at 100.
Slowed down to 40 hours a week.
Yes, at 100.
Okay.
But at one point, she backed into a cabinet, and she got super upset. What employee put this here?
Yeah.
And it's not it's one of those things where it's not like someone put it there on purpose that she would run in. So I feel like she was maybe almost too truthful and too intense. But had she not been like that, then she probably wouldn't have grown her business the way she did.
That's right.
So it's kind of catch-22, I guess you could say.
And I think she was famed for also calling, I know in interviews she called people lazy and stupid and things like that.
Yeah, and then at one point there was actually a luncheon for her or something. It was
this is in her honor,
literally to honor her, and it went on for a while. And she stood up and said, "This is taking too long. I have a furniture shop to run," and she left, walked out and left and went back.
I think she said something. Don't the rest of you have things to do or something like that?
So it's it's a little too honest. And another thing I wanted to touch on was Warren Buffett did buy it, but that was his second offer. He actually tried to buy it before, so he knew it was
20
a good
years
thing.
prior, he tried to buy it as well.
So he waited. This is an example, and we've talked about this with Allegheny, how he waited 60-some odd years to buy that company. He had been watching it. He had offered, I think,
$7 million.
Yeah, in the 60s.
It was in the late 60s. He tried to buy it, and she tossed him out of his ear, called him cheap.
Yeah, she said, "Oh, she said, Mr. Buffett's cheap." Yeah, and I think he actually is. So again, truthful.
Fair enough. Yeah, exactly.
But and then he waited 20 years.
He waited another 20 years or so to buy it.
Yeah, and when he did buy it, I don't think she necessarily sold it to him because she really wanted to sell it. She sold it to him as a succession plan because it was an easy way to divide the company up for her 4 children.
That makes sense. Yeah. And now keep in mind, let's backtrack for a second there. She started the Nebraska Furniture Mart at the age of 43.
Yes.
With 4 children in tow.
Yeah. They were somewhere around 9 to 19. So we have 5 children who are 12 to 21. So it'd be like me
starting a business now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is an incredible woman. So she has these young kids.
And she couldn't speak great English.
So she couldn't speak great English. Yeah. Even at this point, her daughters taught her English.
After school.
After school. They sat her down and tried to help her. And in the end of her life, she spoke some English, but I don't think it was great.
Yeah.
And she never learned to read or write. I'll reiterate that. And which is just incredible. So this is just a phenomenal woman.
She really was a phenomenal woman.
And so for her, I mean, in essence, I guess, she was an honest businesswoman. There's no question about that. But she was a fierce competitor. And we talked about this a little bit before. She actually, when Warren Buffett ended up buying Nebraska Furniture Mart and she got pushed out, let's talk a little bit about what happened there. So she felt slighted because she felt she was getting pushed out of her carpet department.
Right. No, let's backtrack a little bit, actually, before we get to that.
Sure.
So you can see that she was competitive even before that, because when she was starting her furniture mart, which I don't think I mentioned this, but she actually started like in her home. I mentioned it earlier, but I didn't go into that. So a lot of their stuff in their house was packaged still. So they'd have like lampshades on tables, and they'd be like in plastic with price tags. And she said, like, if people... Functioning, yeah. She said if people came over, she'd try and sell it. And if they wanted to, they would leave, like, with whatever they would buy in her house. Like, that was...
Leave with the table.
Yeah, that's how she started her business.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So she wasn't only, like, the original Costco and Walmart. She was the original marketplace in Kijiji. Like, that's what she was. So to go back to the competitive point, before we get to the whole sale and with Buffett and everything, you can see her competitive nature in other areas and... what really drove her. So I already mentioned that the sale. Yeah. The euphoria of the sale drove her. But another thing that drove her was actually revenge. Yes. And the fierce competitiveness. And so she would try to get merchandise to sell. She'd go to the distributors.
This is when she's starting out. Yeah. She has no name, barely any money, no credit.
No credit, right. And no one wanted to sell to her. And they kind of just kicked her out.
They brushed her off.
And she's quoted as pretty much saying, like, when I get big and I'm profitable or wealthy or whatever, she didn't use those words because she didn't speak good English. She said, they're going to come into my store and they're going to try to sell to me and I'm going to kick them out just like they did to me.
Wonderful.
And I feel like sometimes in business, nothing drives you, or in life.
Yeah, like revenge.
Like revenge, or not even revenge, but like proving them wrong.
That's fair. It wasn't revenge. It was so much as, I'm going to prove you wrong and you're going to want to sell to me and... you're not going to be able to.
And and I get that because I'm like that. Yeah. It's just like if someone tells me like, oh, I don't think you can do this, it's like, I do not care. Like come hell or high water, I'm going to do that. Yeah. And that's how she was.
Yeah. Well, she's also reported to, one of her hobbies was apparently driving around and going around to competitors.
Yes.
And basically checking out the competition. So this is a quote from Mrs. B herself. My hobby is figuring out how to advertise, how to undersell, how much hell to give my competitors. I'll never forget how they treated us when we were poor.
Yeah, so she was competitive, but she was also driven a little bit by revenge, or maybe the better word is just like, don't you dare tell me what I can't do.
That's right, proving you wrong.
I'm going to prove you wrong.
That's right. Yeah. Did she ever?
Yeah, she really did. She became just like...
a business titan.
Yeah. So I also have a quote by her that I want to quote because I actually really liked it. It's a good business quote, and it just really captures who Mrs. B was. Yeah. So she says, I want to do all the business I can and get every customer I can. Business is like raising a child. You want a good one. A child needs a mother, and a business needs a boss. And she was quite the boss.
She was quite the boss.
Yeah.
So as we know, Mrs. B sold the Nebraska Furniture Mart to Berkshire Hathaway. And so she was still working in the mart for most of that time. And so up into her 90s, she was still working in the furniture mart. A lot. She and her family, again, retained some interest. I don't know if it was 10 or 20%. The numbers seem to be a little vague.
The interview with Warren Buffett gives a different number than a lot of the
internet resources.
Yeah.
He says Berkshire owned 80% and the internet resources say that they own 90%. I don't know. Either way,
Berkshire had the controlling interest.
That's correct. Either way, Berkshire Hathaway had controlling interest. Now, Mrs. B was still working in the furniture mart, and I think she was in charge of the carpet department.
Yep.
So, what happened?
So her grandsons, essentially, the ones that she refers to in
Hitler.
Hitler. She loved her son. She said, oh, my son's wonderful. My grandsons are Hitler's. Yes. So Berkshire buys them. She, with the intention that she's going to continue working in the carpet area.
Yeah, because Berkshire likes to keep managers on.
Right, and they do. And she was the first, as you mentioned, female manager that Berkshire Hathaway had. She felt that they were not including her enough in the decisions. Okay. And there was some carpet that was kind of out of style that she wanted to sell at a profit. Okay. And her grandsons didn't like that. And there was a little bit of a kerfuffle and
some butting of heads.
Right. And she actually called Warren. Now, her and Warren knew each other well enough because he used to send her roses.
Yeah, every year on her birthday. Yeah.
That she would refer to him as my young boyfriend, my young rich boyfriend. But then she called him, and he didn't actually return her call. But there is mention, and I'm not sure who he said this to or where, but there's mention of him saying, well, she never signed a non-compete.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So, what does Mrs. Blumkin do? She remembers
she quits all of a sudden.
Years earlier, there was... another person who started a furniture store, and they called it Mrs. B's warehouse or something along that line.
Okay.
And the family and her were like, no, you can't do that. Even though it's not Nebraska Furniture Mart, like, come on, like, you're ripping off. I guess it'd be considered like my likeness or whatever.
Right, her character trait. She's
right.
Mrs. B.
She's Mrs. B. So they sued.
Oh, okay.
And then that company eventually couldn't use that name.
Okay.
And everything else. But it says that she banked that name because she liked it in the back of her mind.
Okay.
So she gets pushed out, or she feels she's getting pushed out by her grandsons.
I think she just quit one day, didn't she?
She just walks off.
She just storms out.
Now, she did take a little bit of a time off.
Okay.
In this time. She didn't just storm off with the intention
right.
of starting
okay.
this other business, but she storms off in anger.
Yeah.
Like, you're pushing me out. I'm done. I can't even deal with you. I can't deal with you Hitlers, essentially, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you could just picture her, like, wheeling out, like, all the surly little old lady, right?
Yeah.
Out of the store. And then she's bored. She gets driven around in a taxi for hours a day because she's just so bored she can't stay home.
Yeah.
So she's like, that's it. I'm starting my own company. So she's, like, in her 90s now.
She was 95.
95. She sets up shop across the street from Nebraska Furniture Mart, and she calls it Mrs. B's Warehouse.
Brilliant.
And she sells carpet.
Okay.
And she starts eating their market share.
Wow.
Yeah, at 95 years old.
I think she began, if I recall correctly, she began turning a profit within 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Of setting up shop.
Yeah.
That's how phenomenal of a businesswoman she was.
At 95.
At 95.
And so that's another example of, like, you tell me I can't do this. Like, you young grandsons of mine who I literally built this company for you are going to tell me, like, I don't know carpet. I'm going to show you.
Yeah.
And she showed them.
And I think at one point she was asked, what do you think about the Nebraska Furniture Mart? Oh, and she went off. She said something to the effect of, do you hope it goes out of business? She goes, I hope it goes up in flames. I want they should go to hell or something like that. So this is her fiery... Now, keep in mind, she's this little old woman who's like 4'10" or something like that.
In a scooter.
In a scooter, who's got this personality that's larger than life.
Yeah.
So this is Mrs. B.
Yeah.
So fiercely competitive. Sets up shop across from the Nebraska Furniture Mart. Starts out competing her old business. Hopes it goes under. This is a business that she founded. She says, I don't care. I want it to go out of business, basically.
Pretty much Nebraska Furniture Mart is dead to me. I am Mrs. B's warehouse now.
That's right. So eventually, I think a few years pass or whatnot, and then Warren Buffett helps the family reconcile. She comes back, and I think he actually purchases this new business off of her as well, or amalgamates it into the Furniture Mart.
He bought it off of her as well, and you know what he did?
What's that?
He added a non-compete.
He added a non-compete with her. I bet he never thought he'd have to get a 90-some-odd-year-old woman to sign
He said that, and he said, he's like, I had to get her to sign it because I didn't know how long she was going to go on for.
Well, till 103.
Yeah, exactly.
So the point being is this lady is a fierce competitor. She is not someone you want to trifle with.
Yeah. Now, I want to go back a little bit and just talk about also some of the... We said she was shaped by hardship. Mm-hmm. And one of the things where that really came in useful is that Nebraska Furniture Mart had some hardship. But I think because of her background, she was able to navigate that in ways that maybe other people who were not shaped by hardship could have. So Nebraska Furniture Mart, actually, they had a fire. Mm-hmm. It damaged a lot of inventory.
Yep.
And they had to have a fire sale.
Yep.
And she got through that. There was a huge tornado.
Yep.
Damaged a lot of inventory.
That's right.
A lot of the building.
Well, go back to the fire sale. Mm-hmm. What did she do? She sold the smoke damaged goods on the cheap.
She did, yeah.
And then with the tornado, funny enough, it severely damaged, my understanding, was the Furniture Mart, as well as a neighboring building. Yeah. So what did she do? She bought the neighboring property.
Smart. She saw an business opportunity.
She saw a business opportunity and was ready to capitalize on it.
And then and at one point, so the Korean, again, going back and just showing you how she navigated these hardships. And I think it really was because she had to navigate from the time she was very little. I mean, she moved out at 13, walked miles in bare feet, got a job. Like her whole life was working through things that were not
challenges.
Great. Right. And at one point, business really slowed down during the Korean War.
Okay.
And she actually couldn't pay her bills.
Okay.
And a banker came in and was looking at stuff, and I guess it just came up in conversation. So he personally gave her a $50,000 loan. Wow. And she had to pay it back in 90 days.
Okay.
So she
keep it afloat.
Yeah. So she's like, okay, I'm going to take it. And so she rented an auditorium. She paid, I think it was like $200 a day. Mm-hmm. And she sold an amazing amount of goods. She paid that loan back, and she never took out debt again.
Wow.
But it kind of just shows you, like, her ability with the tornado, like buying up that land and getting through it, her ability to work through the hardships that were not controllable. She couldn't control the Korean War. She couldn't control the tornado.
Can't control fire.
Can't control. Those were out of her control, but she took things that were out of her control and worked within the parameters of that.
And turned them into opportunity.
And then the other thing is, you actually see, as gruff as she was, you see her spirit of generosity.
Yes.
Because with the fire, she ended up donating televisions to all of the firefighters. And then with the tornado, there was quite a bit of, I can't remember if she gave to relief to like charity or something, but there was quite a bit of capital that was given to different people and families in order to help with the tornado. And her whole life she gave, and if you read about her, she was involved in a lot of charities and and she would help a lot of people. She had a soft spot for immigrants, obviously.
Yeah.
She had a very soft spot for the middle class. Yeah. She said the poor and the middle class and Warren Buffett were her heroes. Those were the three heroes that
she loved America.
And she loved America.
Loved America. She saw America as the land that gave her the opportunity to do what she did.
Yeah, she had nothing bad to say about America. She said everyone, when she got to America, they treated her with kindness and graciousness, and they helped get her on her feet.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about don't cheat nobody.
Don't cheat nobody.
So the other thing about Mrs. B is she didn't cheat herself.
Right.
She was a very hard worker. She would work on average 60, 70-hour work weeks. Well, 60-hour work weeks. And apparently the Furniture Mart is open an average of 74 hours per week. So this is a woman who was a tireless worker.
Yeah.
And I'll read some more quotes here just to show you how tireless she was. So this is an interview with Mrs. B, and I think this kind of highlights some of the things we've mentioned already. So the interviewer says, "What is your favorite thing to do on a Sunday afternoon?" She says, "Visit customers at my store." "What is your favorite thing to do on a nice evening?" "Drive around and check out the competition and plan my next attack."
I like that she uses the word attack.
Attack, yes. Yeah. They say, "What is your favorite movie in the last year?" "Too busy." "Favorite book in the last year?" "Don't have time." "Favorite cocktail?" "None. Drinkers go broke." "If you want to be in business, be sober." "Favorite sport in which you take part?" "Not interested." "Pet peeve?" "Deadbeats."
Yeah, that would annoy someone who worked that much.
Yeah. "Favorite place?" "My stores."
Okay.
So these are some just selected quotes from an interview with Mrs. B, which I think just highlights her well. Again, she was a tireless worker. She celebrated her 100th birthday at the Furniture Mart.
Of course she did.
Because it was her favorite place to be.
Yeah, she was a widow for a lot of years.
Yeah, she was.
And so she already loved her Furniture Mart well. She was married.
Yeah.
I think that her husband died after 36 years of marriage, and then she lived 40-something years afterwards. So the Furniture Mart really did become her love.
And her baby.
And her baby. Yeah. It was her child and her love. That is just, and you can see that in her.
So for her also, it wasn't about the money. So running the Furniture Mart was about the sales and about the business. She just loved the business, and the material result, I think, was secondary. Now, she didn't like being poor, and she references that, but I think for her, as you mentioned earlier, it was kind of the rush of the sale and really sticking it to her competitors and that fierce drive to build just a great business. I think she was very, very interested in that.
And she was also interested, like I said before, one of the things that originally drove her was that she did not want her mother to have to work the way she grew up seeing her mom. And I will say she actually brought her parents over to America and some more of her family. So she actually got to do what she wanted to do from the age of 6 to help her mother out, and she did it. Yeah,
she just had that drive to do it. It's no wonder a woman like that succeeded.
Yeah.
So another thing about Mrs. B is she was a decisive businesswoman. Apparently she didn't second guess anything. And I've got a quote by Buffett, I think, that exemplifies that, because this is pretty much the only thing I could find on that character trait of hers. It says this: "Everything Mrs. B knew how to do, she would do fast. She didn't hesitate, and there was no second guessing. She'd buy 5,000 tables, or sign a 30-year lease, or buy real estate, or hire people. There was no looking back. She just swung." She just swung, and she knocked it out of the park.
She really did. And I would have liked to have been able to find more things that she failed on. But
that would have been nice, actually,
just to see. But I'm wondering if she just was one of those people who didn't really fail.
Or turned failures into opportunities.
That's what I'm wondering. Like, if a lot of people would have walked away from something, like maybe when the Korean War started and she was going to go out, maybe a lot of people would have closed shop. So maybe she just didn't fail because she wasn't willing to.
I think that's true. I think she just had that persevering personality. Because everyone has setbacks, and she obviously did. She had some major ones.
Major setbacks.
Fires, tornadoes. Her whole life was a setback.
It's really true.
Not being able to read or write, having to flee her home country with $60 in your pocket.
Having to move out at 13.
Unreal. Let's go back to her exit, brilliant exit from the Nebraska Furniture Mart. And let's talk about that, because you found an interesting statistic on this.
Yes. So it wasn't really a statistic. It was just an interesting side note that someone had mentioned. I was like, that's true. So she took $55 million.
Yep.
She had
in cash.
She had 4 children. They split it between her 4 children and herself. Mm-hmm. Like I said, it was kind of like her succession plan. She had an interesting idea about how she didn't want her daughters working in the family business.
Yeah, I don't know
why. It was kind of weird, because it wasn't because she wasn't against women in the workforce, because
obviously
she was, and she actually said she would like to see more women working, but it was like, I guess, some weird philosophy that she had. So it was like just a nice exit, because she could divide it, give them cash and whatnot. One person said, what if instead of taking $55 million, they had just taken stock, and not even $55 million worth of stock, but only $1 million worth of stock at the time.
Sure.
So we looked back to see how much that would be, and I think we said that was about 870 shares of Berkshire Hathaway, and that would have been Berk
A shares,
which are now like over $600,000.
Yes.
So that was just an interesting side comment. It really has nothing to do with Mrs. B, but it really reminded me that equity is king.
Oh, absolutely.
Ownership is king.
Yeah.
Now, of course, again, for her, it was a nice, clean way for a succession plan and to get her kids to kind of to cash out for her family. Mm-hmm. But again, it's just a reminder, like, there's something about equity.
Absolutely. So what would have happened if she had done that deal?
So again, that would have been $539 million.
At today's price.
Yeah. Right. Now she got $55 million, so then you have to think, okay, well, yeah, but now you're talking about $1 million of stock, and she got $55 million, so we have to adjust the $55 million.
Sure.
I think the $55 million would have been something like $320 million adjusted for inflation, so she would have still ended up on top had she took the shares. But you have to remember that this hypothetical situation, there's only 1 million in shares.
That's right.
Imagine if she took like 30 million in shares.
I was going to say, imagine if she had parlayed that into Berkshire stock on her own. Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. Of course, we don't know if Buffett would have done that. And
who knows?
We don't know everything, but it's always just fun to look at the what ifs.
That's right, yeah.
So I think we've done as much as we could have done with the resources that we were able to get.
Honestly, there's not a lot about Mrs. B out there. Like, this is an intrepid businesswoman. My question is, how is there not more out there? There is
such a, like, not even like a businesswoman. Like, this is one of the best business people out there.
She generated a return that most people only dream of. So Warren Buffett himself has said, like, to interns that come and, come talk to him and whatnot, he says, apparently he takes them to the Furniture Mart. He says, study Mrs. B. Mm-hmm. If you can take what she says and you learn from her, you need nothing from me.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, because she was just fantastic.
She was again, I'll use the word intrepid businesswoman. Just a magnate.
Yeah. Let's recap her 3 tenets.
Yeah. So her 3 tenets were sell cheap, tell the truth, don't cheat nobody.
So those were her 3 tenets, and then I kind of came up with my own idea of, outside of those 3 tenets, what drove her. Mm-hmm. And what drove her was the euphoria of the sale.
Yep.
Competitiveness.
Yep.
And the need to prove other people wrong.
Absolutely.
So that is kind of like, if you are looking for a formula for business, it kind of seems like that is the formula.
It does, actually. Mm-hmm. And I think you were correct before when you said, a lot of these successful business people would have a lot of these similar attributes.
I would 100% agree
Which is interesting.
Yeah. So I think what we'll end with is, in an interview, Warren Buffett actually described Mrs. B.
Yes.
And I think we'll end with what he said, because he knew her personally.
Yes.
And he also knew her in business.
Yes. And next to her, he's probably one of the best businessmen out there.
Yeah, 100%. So there are 4 attributes that he gives Mrs. B. She was smart. She was a fierce competitor. She was a tireless worker, and she had a realistic attitude.
What more can you say?
Yeah. So we're going to wrap it up there. I hope you liked this conversation. If you can like and subscribe to our videos, that really helps us, and we will see you next week.